So we are a society founded in 2011 by a group of students who have attended a conference by Bank of England called Our Economics Graduates Fit for Purpose. The point of the conference was assessing whether we need a different economics education and whether this current economics education is fit for purpose, and whether economics graduates are fit to do their job after they graduate. After that, we have implemented a number of changes, including introducing different modules and introducing different tweaks in individual lectures as well. Then we published a report in 2014 which was outlining the failures of economics teachings, and now we are publishing a 5-year update this year, which is going to outline what needs to be improved and how far we have come from then. Then I would like to introduce our judges, Dr. Danielle Guizot, who is a senior lecturer at University of West England. Her research focuses on philosophy and history of political economy, economics education, and heterodox economics. Then we have Professor Jamie Morgan, who comes from Leeds University. His research focuses on contemporary economic problems in socio-economic context. So, for example, financialization, artificial intelligence, among other things. He also used to be the coordinator of the Association for Heterodox Economists. So thank you for coming. Thank you to both of you. Then I will give the podium to Bianca now. She will outline the structure of the debate.
Hello everyone, I'm Bianca. I had the pleasure of joining Postgrad this year. So I'm just going to walk you through a couple basic parts of how to follow this debate, essentially. The motion, to remind you all, is this House believes that big tech is more productive than it is destabilizing. Often one of the critiques of debates is that they argue things in a binary, it's either black or white. However, this motion actually includes a lot of different points. What is big tech? What does it mean to be productive? What is destabilizing? Can productivity and destabilization exist at the same time? So hopefully we'll hear the debaters unpack all of that. The style of debate that they will be following is not classic British parliamentary, but is extemporaneous. Therefore, Durham, who will be the affirmative, defending the motion that it is more productive, will be beginning with a 6-minute constructive. Hereby, it is in Durham's order to actually define any terms that they wish to define. After that, they go into cross-examination, meaning that Manchester, from where they are sitting, will be asking Durham questions. We then repeat this lovely fiasco 4 times. After that, and this is where they actually get to explain their contentions, their parts of the argument. After that, we all have a break. They will be taking 6 minutes of prep time to coalesce and think between themselves of how they then want to approach their rebuttal. So the rebuttals will be, again, alternating between Manchester and Durham, and the majority of this time will be taken up by them arguing against each other. Something that I wanted to highlight to you guys as you follow the debate is the fact that our judges will be looking for not only how the case is structured, how the presentation is laid out, but also the clash between the two sides, how they really highlight the points of contention between them and whether they're able to fully flesh them out throughout the course of the debate. And yeah, now I'll invite Nikhil, who is the representative from Durham, to introduce the Durham side.
Hello. Hi, so I'm Nikhil. I'm the president of the Durham Society for Economic Pluralism, which is a less catchy name than post-crash economics, to be sure. We were started 3 years ago with similar kind of ideas, with concerns that after the financial crisis and after this kind of crisis of economic theory, as it were, that our education that we were getting was not up to the mark and wasn't teaching us things that we needed to know. And it just wasn't teaching us to be the best economists we could be. So we started with similar ideas, like writing a curriculum report, inviting speakers from all over the country and now all over Europe, I guess we can say, since we've had one guy from Amsterdam, who's come and given a talk. And yeah, it's similar kind of ideas. We've been working on a blog and a magazine, which Stefan is in charge of, which we'll be publishing very soon. And yeah, we love talking about heterodox economics. Thank you.
Thanks, Nikhil. I would also invite all of the debaters to introduce themselves. Durham, would you like to start?
I'm Nikhil. Third year PPE. I'm from India originally.
I'm Stefan. I'm straight economics second year, and I'm from South Africa and the United States.
Hello, I'm Alexander. I'm doing economics as well, and I'm in my first year.
Hi, I'm Patrick. I do PP as well, and I'm from Nick Cambridge Wells.
I'm Polly. I'm first year economics, and I'm from Belfast.
I'm Maya. I'm first year PPE. I'm from Denver in the US.
I'm Xanthra. I'm a second year economics student, and I'm from Manchester.
I'm Francis. I'm a second year economics and history student, and I'm from Switzerland.
Thank you, guys. Well, I think we shall start. Ready?
Before we begin, just so you're all aware, the debaters are aware, I will be keeping time from here. You will be getting a 3-minute, 2-minute, 1.5-minute warning. Make sure that you project your voice. Audience, if you can't hear them, just wave, make sure they do that. It's right over there, it's the little thing.
Can I try without?
Yeah.
Okay. Can everyone hear me without the mics? Is it okay? Cool. Okay. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're here to discuss the motion. This House believes that big tech is more productive than it is destabilizing. To try and unpack this very, very loaded question, it's important that we define what we're talking about before we proceed. And there's 3 important terms that we think need to be outlined and defined. The first is big tech. Now this is a relatively uncontroversial one. Big tech, usually in journalism and in economics academia, is used to mean the 5 major major IT companies in the world, which are Alphabet, Amazon, Facebook, Microsoft, and Apple. These companies have risen in the last few years to the absolute heights of the world economy. And they are inarguably the most important industries in the stock market at the moment. In that they're leading, in fact last year they were 5 of the 6 highest valued companies on the stock market. The second one is productivity. Now this is a little bit more difficult a topic and one that can mean a lot of things. In the one sense, you can talk about productivity in the sense of labor or capital productivity, which strictly speaking means output per worker or output per unit of input, more generally. We've not used this definition because this definition doesn't really allow for much conversation or much debate, because then it's essentially a debate about 2 empirical measures which aren't really comparable. So when we talk about productivity, and when the constructive team will talk, the affirmative team will talk about productivity, what we mean is productivity in a much more general sense. So productivity in terms of output, in terms of innovation, in terms of uses in other industry, and overall contribution to the economy. Understandably, this is a much more kind of qualitative definition. It's a lot harder to pin a specific number on. But we feel that this definition is much more appropriate for discussing this topic because it allows for some debate, it allows for some conversation about it. The third definition we'd like to make is destabilizing. Again, for something to be unstable or destabilized can mean a lot of different things. When we talk about it, we mean stability for us means the smooth movement of macro variables. So variables like output, wages, unemployment, profits, these kind of things. This means that sudden and rapid fluctuations in any of these variables can be thought of as unstable, and smooth movement of any of these variables can be thought of as stable. There's also more qualitative definitions that we can talk about when we talk about the fragility of the economy, for example. Leading up to the 2008 financial crisis, what a lot of people argued is that the economy was increasingly fragile. This was mainly due to large amounts of debt, which were piled up in the hands of companies and in the hands of banks and households as well. And this was fragile because, or rather, making the economy more fragile because this debt was badly managed, and that's what eventually led to the financial crisis. Now, to move on. Why is big tech productive in the sense that we talked about it? Big tech, as I've said, is, well, the tech industry, rather, is the most important and largest industry in the world right now. Last year, it was estimated to be worth $5.2 trillion. And like I said, is currently at the top of the S&P 500, and in all stock markets across the world is one of the highest commands the highest prices for its shares. And big tech, the 5 companies I talked about, produces the lion's share of that output. In fact, around 35% estimated by them. These companies employ millions of people around the world, both directly and indirectly, directly being employed by their own company, and indirectly being employed by other companies which are affiliated with them and work with them. Now, these companies are highly innovative. They have led advances in AI, in machine learning, in various other areas in the IT industry, which have produced massive improvements in the world economy and in our standards of living. They've improved communication, as well as allowing for the digital economy, which is such an important part of the economy as we understand it now, all over the world to form. Furthermore, about 95% of OECD countries, about 95% of companies in OECD countries, rather, use products made by big tech in their everyday functioning, which just goes to highlight the extent to which these companies are essential for the everyday functioning of economies around the world. They've improved managerial structures in economies, they've improved connectiveness, communication, and they've also generated ecosystems, which has allowed other small startups to develop and work within the ecosystem of the given country. The App Store is an excellent example of this. Now, why is it big tech monopoly that makes this possible? Well, big tech monopoly is frankly speaking the most cost-effective, cost-minimizing, and efficient way of producing the products that need to be produced in order for the global economy to function. They do this primarily through innovation, through R&D departments. As we know, tech is an incredibly capital-intensive industry and needs massive amount of investment in order to innovate in anything. And big tech monopolies, because of their consolidation of wealth, have the capability to introduce these kind of investments, introduce these kind of innovations, which allow smaller companies and other companies that are subsidiary to them to innovate and make a better world economy. There's also consolidation effects and network effects which contribute to the same thing. Now, my second speaker will talk to you more about why a big tech company might not be as destabilizing as one might think. Thank you.
You talked about how big tech companies were cost effective and cost minimizing, yet all big tech companies you listed pay their CEOs huge salaries. Steve Jobs got 12.7 million, or not Steve Jobs, Tim Cook got $12 million bonus in 2018. Why is that cost effective or cost minimizing and leads to productivity?
It's cost effective in the sense that when I meant cost effective, I mean that they can produce products at the lowest price and with the highest level of efficiency. That has little to do with how much salary they're paying their executives or the distribution of wealth within the company. It's to do with the fact that they have the money to invest in making their products more efficient and allowing them to be produced at a much lower cost because of their access to resources. Thank you.
So you describe how tech is the largest industry in the economy. Why is this largeness within the industry? How does that translate specifically to stability?
How does it translate to stability?
Yeah, so you describe how it's a large part of the market, but if it's a large part of an unstable market, then how does that translate directly to stability?
Well, so I think this is an interesting point, and I think this is where a lot of the debate has to be made. Because what we're arguing is not necessarily that big tech is not destabilizing. What we're arguing is instead that big tech is far more productive than it is destabilizing. Now, yes, big tech does exist in a market environment which is relatively unstable. But one, we do not believe that big tech is unique in this respect, and that big tech alone can contribute to a large amount of destability in the economy, which is not also a characteristic of just capitalist production in general. There's nothing kind of specific to big tech which does this. And secondly, what we're trying to establish again is that big tech is far more productive than it is destabilizing. And what I've listed is reasons that big tech monopolies are incredibly productive. And yes, they may have some destabilizing effects as well. But those
Sorry. So why is it specifically the wealth consolidation of monopolies that you mentioned that is key to their productivity? Why can't other firms have similar investment?
So, like I said,
The question stagnates as the time ended.
Okay. Thank you.
Can everyone hear me? Yeah? Alright, I'd like to start my time now. So I'm Sandra and I'll be arguing against the resolution. So my opponents did me the favor of defining monopolies, but just to understand how much of a monopoly these companies are, I'm going to give you some figures. So Google, for example, has a 90% market share in the search engine market. Facebook has about a 70% market share in the social media app market, and the EU would define a monopoly by any company that, using their economic strength, can prevent effective competition. So I've given you some figures as to why they're monopolies. Now I want to explain why they're destabilizing. So we believe that they're destabilizing in every layer of life, so economic, political, and to the very sense of our individual self. So we will be examining these through how they affect the economy, how they erode the foundations of our effective democracy, and how they cut to the core of what it means to be a human in everyday society. So first of all, let's investigate as to how these monopolies stifle competition. So I want to do this by looking at three methods. First of all, I'll look at platform bias, predatory pricing, and then killer acquisitions. So platform bias is when a company can deter competition by promoting their own products instead of a rival's. This can be seen with Google. Through the past decade, Google has been fined by the EU for about 9 billion in 3 separate cases for promoting their own goods in their search engine. Now just remember that Google has a 90% share in the search engine market, so their effects are really important. So this is an example of platform bias. Moving on, we have predatory pricing. Now predatory pricing is when a firm sets the price below competition in an attempt to get rid of this competition. According to Lina Khan, who is a professor at Columbia University, she's a professor of law, she has found evidence that Amazon has used this tactic. Now, I'm not sure if any of you are familiar, but there was this case with diapers.com where it was an emerging business and it was selling diapers, and then Amazon came along and they cut prices so low that diapers.com could not compete with them, and they ended up selling the business to Amazon. This is also an example of a killer acquisition. So a killer acquisition is when a firm intentionally acquires potential competition to stop them from growing in the future and becoming a huge threat to them. So I've given you some examples of things that these big tech monopolies have done. And this matters because it stifles competition, and without competition, there is lower levels of innovation, though my opponent has said that we do have innovation with this, with a monopoly. It's important to know that there's just one company innovating. What about different ideas coming from different startups? That's not possible when there's no competition. And then we also have less variety. no amount of innovation can make up for the lack of variety that we get from only having monopolies. And all of these also matter because without these tiny companies coming into play, when there's a downturn in the economy, it's these tiny companies that start up that help, fuel the economy and help it to recover. So without this, the economy is really suffering. So this is what I would like to say about big tech companies from an economic point of view. And then now I'd like to move on to how it's not just limited to the economy, it destabilizes our democracy. They're seen in two primary ways. So we have lobbying effects, and then we have algorithmic manipulation. So I think lobbying is the most obvious one. Tech companies have spent millions in the last year alone on lobbying. So Facebook has spent $12 million in 2018. Amazon spent 14 million, Google spent 21 million on lobbying, and a lot of this was against data protection laws. There have been documents released that show that Facebook has focused their lobbying on legislators in an attempt to make sure that Facebook-friendly laws were passed. Also, Facebook has threatened legislators saying they will not invest if there is an absence of Facebook-friendly laws. So this is a direct way in which monopolies abuse democracy because they're paying to have their laws, have their opinions be seen in the economy. Another way is through algorithmic manipulation. So some of you may remember last year when Mark Zuckerberg was called into court. So that is a great example of how democracy is being affected by these big tech companies because they are getting all their money from data. And data is a precious resource. It's important to us. It's about our privacy. It's about us. And this data leak has, it happened to billions of users on Facebook, and it allowed Cambridge Analytica, a company, to focus their campaigning on so many, on people who could be easily manipulated. So my teammate Francis will be continuing to talk about this and how we're losing on democracy because of this. And he will also be giving a third reason on how it affects our own individual selves in other ways. And I would like to conclude my speech with that. Thank you.
So I have one question. You spoke about how big tech companies are destabilising because they affect the economy, politics, and the individual. I just want to make it very clear, how are you defining destabilisation? Because during that argument, you never linked any of those three factors back to what Nikhil said about how destabilisation is just the effects on key macro variables and the level of fluctuation in those variables.
So destabilisation, it depends on the view we take on it. So I mentioned that I'm looking at it in three ways: political, through political, economic, and through a social lens. So in terms of economic, I would mean macro variables, just as Nicole suggested. In terms of political, I'm talking about how it's affecting democracy and how democracy may not be able to function. And then in terms of social...
Okay, thank you. I'd like to follow up on that point. A lot of what you're describing sounds like it's morally wrong, which is true. Like it does affect democracy and it does erode it, but you haven't found any link between that and how that is unstable for the economy.
I think at the end of the day that a lot of what is democracy is about what is, morally right and people representing their opinions. I think it's morally wrong that people's opinions are being influenced because that's what Cambridge Analytica did. And because of this, it had effects on democracy which are destabilizing. So these moral effects link into how these political effects are going.
Given that democracy is inherently unstable as a political system, how does the fact that people can direct it mean that it's more unstable?
Sorry, could you repeat your question?
So democracy is an inherently unstable system, right? So the fact that people can pay money and make it more easily directed, how does that make it more unstable?
It makes it more unstable because it's just that democracy, it's about people having their opinions, and it's fair if you know, the election process isn't stable or those kind of things. But in terms of big tech companies, when they pass laws that aren't stable, that affect stability in other ways, then it adds to the instability. So it's making it more destabilizing.
Okay, thank you. So you talked a lot about predatory pricing, platform acquisition, and I can't read acquisition, skill acquisition, sorry. You haven't established how exactly these things are sort of destabilizing, because stability presumably means something to do with like smoothness and like something to do with how variables progress. Whereas you've not established how any of these things have anything to do with how kind of structurally smooth the economic process is.
The question stands as time has elapsed.
Good morning to the House at large. My name is Stefan. Once again, I'll be the second speaker beside proposition. I forgot what that side is called, to be honest. In terms of how I'm going to structure this debate, my arguments, I'm going to spend about 1 or 2 minutes rebutting the opposition's case, and then I'm going to promote my own argument. So the two pieces of constructive analysis I'll be running is how big tech firms, if they're destabilizing or not, and even if they are, how this isn't very bad for the economy at large. The second point I'll be doing is how big tech actually, contrary to the opposition's point, has the incentive and the ability to protect their data and protect networking effects. But first I'll get onto some rebuttal. So to start with, as Nikhil and my team said, side opposition has brought a lot of points to why big tech might be morally incorrect or unjustified, such as predatory pricing, the acquisitions they spoke of. However, they haven't provided any single link onto why these are inherently destabilizing to the economy. And for that reason, we don't feel that those points stand. The second thing I'd like to bring up is about democracy and how they said how big tech will often spread political populism, which is morally unjustified, and etc. However, we would also say that it's also because of big tech that we have such an array of their ability to spread ideas and knowledge today. They haven't taken that into account. Excuse me. And once again, they didn't link that to how that is destabilizing for the economy either. Lastly, in terms of innovation, we would like to say that big tech actually has more ability to innovate because they have larger capital, they have more R&D, so they have more means and ability to innovate themselves. And we've seen in the past that they actually don't stifle innovation from smaller companies. There's been plenty of smaller companies in the tech industry that have been able to come up with ideas and products that big tech has then acquired and actually promoted innovation at large. The last thing I'd like to touch on is she mentioned how small companies are beneficial to us post-recession, which I just fundamentally disagree with. I think it was the point that after a recession, it allows the opportunities for small companies, and that allows employment. But I would actually argue that big companies are better post-recession because they can employ more people and stimulate aggregate demand to a greater effect. But now enough rebuttal, I'm going to get on to my main point. So my main point of argumentation is the stability of big tech. So first of all, I'd like to say that big tech is monopolistic. Because of this monopolistic nature, they don't have a need. They don't have any competition. They don't have a need to price their products. To increase the price of their products. What this means is that if you compare it to like the big banks of the financial crisis, the big banks were in a competitive industry and competitive nature that needed other ways to find profit. So this led to innovation of financial instruments, which led to the leveraging and as a result, the overall downturn of the economy. What we see is that big tech monopolies have no need to do any of this because they have a low price already and have such a huge market share of the economy. Excuse me. Furthermore, the products that tech companies actually do compete on aren't destabilizing to the economy. So big tech will compete on products such as in like their websites or their coding, whereas big banks will compete on products like financial derivatives, which are destabilizing to the economy. So for that first reason, we see that big tech is actually quite a stable industry. Secondly, we see that big tech depends on consumer confidence to function. In a post-financial crisis, since big banks have been bailed out, they now know that big banks know that they will be bailed out should they engage in financial misconduct. And consumers know that too. However, big tech has no guarantee of that. And even if they did, the consumers don't have any guarantee of that either. So what that means is that if big tech were to engage in financially risky behavior and go bankrupt, there's no guarantee that they would be bailed out, which means their consumer confidence would be heavily decreased. Since they depend so much on this consumer confidence for their products, because the consumers buy the products, then they don't have any incentive to do this anymore. Furthermore, as the opposition pointed out for me, big tech engages in a lot of very, shall we say, immoral behavior. They're already under a lot of scrutiny, which is just one more reason for them not to engage in financially risky behavior, because they're already on such moral scrutiny. So for those reasons, we see that big tech is inherently stable. However, the argument then becomes, even if they are unstable, and even if they crash, we see that that is not an unstabilizing tendency of any large magnitude. If you compare it to the financial crisis, the reason that was so big wasn't because of the housing bubble crashing. It was because that the entire consumer base of the economy was essentially in debt. And after banks stopped lending to the consumers and hoarding wealth, no one could pay back money. What we see there is that if big tech pops, the only people who really lose out are the shareholders of big tech, which is a very small population of the economy. There was a stat for the USA that said, I think, only 20% of the population even invests at all. And of that 20%, 10% of them are the financially richest people in the economy. So we see that if big tech were to fall, aggregate consumption would be largely unaffected because most of the economy would be consuming normally. There might be a decrease in aggregate investments, but we don't see that to any large effect. Furthermore, there's an argument to be made that should big tech crash, this would actually lead to more productivity for the economy. If you look at the dot-com bubble, it's been said that the lessons the investors learned from that bubble was more productive for the economy going into the future. So we see that even if they were to crash, this could be actually a productive argument for us. So what I proved to you today is that big tech is inherently quite stable, and should it actually crash, the effect of that instability is not very large, and our productivity argument still far outweighs that. And that is my time, basically.
So you describe how, or your teammate described in the first speech, how interlinked these firms are to the economy and how like 95% of OECD countries rely on these firms. And then you also describe how only a small part of the economy will be affected if these firms crash. How does this contradiction stand?
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, yeah, they're very linked to the economy in terms of, you know, how many people use it in terms of digitalization and you know, the internet as a whole. But I think what you're referring to, if big tech crashes, the internet crashing and the digital economy crashing, which isn't true. The digital economy would still stand, as would the internet. There might be some, you know, small reduction in it. It's a bit of temporary time for the adjustment, but that, I don't think that argument holds, because big tech crashing is not analogous to the internet or the digital economy crashing.
You talked about how the financial crash hurt everyone because everyone had a stake in it, but if big tech pops, only shareholders lose out.
Yeah.
We're all invested in big tech. All of us in this room probably have Google accounts, Apple phones. If any of those companies crash, we can no longer access our data, our documents, or all those things we hold special online, or our phones won't work, we won't be able to update them. How does that stand?
Okay, so on the one hand, yeah, shareholders lose out. I think what you're referring to is then how not investors lose out, but how people who utilize big tech lose out, which is fair enough. But the argument against that is that once big tech crashes, as I said, there would be an adjustment period where, yeah, sure, I think economic growth would slow down to a degree. I think we would have a little bit of instability in the economy. However, as soon as they crash, there'll be more than enough competitors rising up to fill in that gap.
Thank you. So where in the resolution is this like lack of stability? Where in the resolution does it say that's specifically economic?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, so you describe how our definition of destabilizing is inadequate because it doesn't refer to the economy. Where in the resolution is it explicit that this is economic instability?
I think that's more, I think to be honest, that's rather obvious. I think we're worried about when we talk about big tech and monopolies being destabilizing is the economy specifically. I think that, sure, you can talk about political destabilization, but that's been around since politics began. I think the economic destabilization is the crux of the argument.
If big tech crashes and we all lose everything we store on Google servers, that's not destabilizing.
No, it is destabilizing. That's true. But what we're saying is the extent of that magnitude is far, far less than the extent of the productivity of big tech.
I have a question. So you said big companies, it would be better for big companies during a downturn to employ more people. What makes you think that these big companies will employ more people during a downturn?
It's not that they do it during a downturn, it's that at the end of the downturn, once we need to get the economy going, right at the end of the downturn, to get that aggregate demand up and the stimulation up, that's when they have the capacity to employ more people. No sane company would be employing more people in the middle of a recession, that's true.
Time.
Cool. Thank you.
Let's just try without the microphone. Can everybody at the back hear me? Right, thank you. So as my colleague specifically mentioned, what we'd like to focus on, and it isn't specifically put in the question, is this idea that it is not only the economy that will be destabilized by these monopolies. It is our democracy, as we mentioned, but also specifically society and how us as humans work within it. I would like to talk then specifically about how, for the sake of revenue, these companies are changing the way we work. These companies need advertisers. Facebook needs advertisers. 99% of their revenue comes from advertisers. And to be able to be interesting to these advertisers, they have to keep us on their site. And the way they do this is by designing their sites in ways that are attractive, that lure us, that are addicting to us. I'm sure this has happened to all of you when you were going through you opened your phone, you went through your Facebook feed, and then you realized 40 minutes had passed. This is not an accident. This is done by purpose in order to keep you on their site so they can find out more about you. They are using our base instincts against us by taking away things that have existed since the start of media. Since the introduction of the Gutenberg press, we have had an end point to whatever it is we are doing. If you take up a book, there is an end to your page, there is an end to the book. If you go on, if you were to put in a DVD into your computer, there is an end to that DVD. Now Netflix autoplays your videos, now Facebook autoplays your videos. If you try and scroll down your feed, it will continue to scroll and scroll and scroll until you run out of battery. This is just a way in which they're hacking our brain against us for the sake of profit. I would also like to talk about more specifically how these platforms are polarizing society and then democracy by creating what we call filter bubbles. So a filter bubble is these feeds that you see are curated. They are not everybody you have on your Facebook speaking to another. What they are is that they are, in an attempt to keep you on their website, filtered so that the things that might keep you away will not show up. The things that will actually make you want to stay will show up. Things that will cause you joy, like a cat video. I mean, there is a reason why YouTube grew to such an extent. And things like fear and anger and the sort of populism you will find nowadays that is spreading. Those truly grew on Facebook and in Facebook groups. Cass Sunstein said that in her book Nudge, that as soon as you take a closed group, which Facebook is currently massively encouraging, you will get a polarization of that group. Now, I'm not saying that they're polarizing everybody. What I am, however, specifically saying is that they are moving the center of our democracy to the left and to the right in towards extremes. And they are then abusing other things, such as FOMO for short, or fear of missing out. If you were to decide to leave Facebook because you found it to be taking up all of your productive time, you would be faced with a screen saying, Tom and Jessica are on this site. If you leave, you will not be able to speak to them on this site. They are directly and personalizing this as, if you leave, you will not be able to speak to your friends. You will lose on the network connectivity that is on Facebook. They are using your friends against you to try and keep you specifically on that site. This is not just an abuse of market power, because we have nothing to say about this. This is a change in our society for their sake. It is destabilizing the market, sure, but what it is really doing is destabilizing our culture and ourselves by addicting us to something that is not productive for us. Thank you.
Given that your first speaker made a point that innovation is greater when you have competition, and that innovation in this kind of competitive tech market is to hook people on social media platforms to maximize advertising, presumably. Given that you believe that innovation is greater in a competitive market, is your objection to technology per se because the capacity is to hook people on it, or is your objection to the monopoly itself?
Sorry, can you rephrase the question if possible?
If there were competition between different tech companies, they would be competing to hook people on their site, right? So there would be more attempts to make you addicted. And given that your opening speaker made a point that you want to promote such innovation by having more competition in the market, do you disagree with that, or do you object to technology in general?
We obviously don't object to technology in general. That is, rather proposed as a statement. But directly, there is the idea you're talking about that there would be a competition in addiction, if that's what I'm understanding you. That per se would not. I'm sorry, I'm not actually quite understanding what you mean.
Their aim is to maximize profit, and they maximize profit by getting you addicted to their site, because then they get more ad revenue.
Yes.
So they're trying to get you hooked on their site. So there's more incentive, because there's competition between companies, to innovate to get you more hooked on their site. So if you object to people, being hooked on social media, then you object to more competition, surely.
We don't object to more competitions, but the issue here is actually that they isn't directly competition. It's an idea of regulation. So if you were to regulate against some of these bad practices, you would be able to have competition in a market that is, quite safe. The issue with that is the point that my colleague was mentioning, is the lobbying power they have is stopping us from.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Could you, so you talked a lot about a kind of mixture between stability of the individual, of individual people, and stability of culture as well, and how big tech destabilizes culture as well as destabilizes the individual. Could you please define what you mean exactly by those definitions of destabilizing?
So things like democracy or culture, they are necessary for us, but also for the economy to function. And what we're saying by this destabilization is that they are changing the way our behavior in a way that is, I guess, unnatural, and in a way that we can...
What about Singapore?
The time's lapsed. What about Okay, guys, we'll have a 6-minute break and then return if you want to use the bathroom. You're free to leave. So
Yeah, but then I'm out now. I even like
Everyone, we will recommence. We have decided to, at the end, allot some time for some questions from the audience. Those questions and their answers will not count towards the judge's ballot, but if you guys want to think up of some questions to ask any of them, feel free. Okay, we'll be starting for the rebuttals. These are all 4 minutes, and there will be no cross-examination.
Okay, am I using this microphone correctly? Try and figure this. Is this working?
Yes.
Cool, okay. All right, so first I'm going to talk about the definition of dynamism. So here I'd like to address that nothing in the resolution explicitly, destabilisation. Nothing in the resolution explicitly states that it's economic destabilisation. However, our opponents continually hammer us on the fact that we're not exclusively talking about macroeconomic variables. So first, you're going to prefer our more generalized definition of what destabilisation means, because we should be taking a more varied approach to this. The world isn't simply neoclassical economics. There's more factors at play to destabilisation that we should be focusing on. And here I'd like you to extend our points about democracy and how democracy becomes more unstable when these corporations are first able to lobby, but second able to polarize us in ways never before, because there are no alternatives and no regulation on these monopolies. Secondly, extend our ideas of our sense of self, because again, the problem is the lack of alternative to these platforms, and that is caused by the fact that they are monopolies. Now, while our definition is better, we're also able to take a more neoclassical approach as well to match what they're saying. So first is the idea of economic dynamism. So first, barriers to entry are a key issue for younger firms being able to enter the economy. And these corporations make the barriers to entry higher. Again, extending the point about killer acquisitions and predatory pricing. Only a monopoly has the ability to set these prices to predatory levels, which makes it so that younger firms cannot enter. You're going to extend that dollars.com example, which is very explicitly clear about how innovation does not occur underneath these monopolies, they're simply acquired. Additionally, our opponents discuss how these monopolies have no competition, so there's no incentive to raise prices. Extend the dollars.com example again. Once Amazon acquired this corporation, the price of diapers skyrocketed on the platform, and it's because they have exclusive pricing power. Additionally, to be innovative, you have to be dynamically efficient. And the main innovations that they're talking about with these corporations weren't the corporations initially. They were all either government funded or acquired. For example, looking at Apple, Siri, GPS, touchscreen, maps, and Bluetooth were all acquired innovations from other corporations or from the government. Additionally, we need a dynamic economy with lots of small firms entering and exiting to smooth out the business cycle. An NPR report from 2019 is very explicit about how these young firms being able to engage in what is known as creative destruction is explicitly key to smooth out the harms of the business cycle. They describe how these firms, these big firms, are going to be what gets us out of the recession, but that's not true. These firms have no incentive to enter testy waters, while smaller firms simply do have that incentive. They also again conceded that the market is unstable in cross-examination debate, and a large part of this is because these monopolies are not properly regulated and there's no ability to take care of them. Additionally, they talk about how a big part of the economy these monopolies are, how we're so interconnected by them, so reliant on them, but somehow also a crash isn't going to impact us in the slightest. But imagine, our Apple laptops vanish, our ability to access Google vanishes, all of our ability to use these platforms go away. Are you saying we will not be impacted by this? This contradiction makes no sense. Because we're putting all of our eggs into this single big tech monopoly basket, we're unable to really have a dynamic economy that we need for stability. So first, you're going to prefer our definition of stability. It's the more varied approach and it reflects the real world more accurately. But secondly, due to killer acquisitions, due to the way that we're unable to regulate these monopolies, and due to the fact that they simply price things out of control, you're going to be preferring our side in today's debate.
This is microphone on, doesn't really stick.
No, that one doesn't work, I'm sorry.
That's fine. Start. Right, so you spoke about how we haven't hammered the point of democracy enough, and I think when you talk about the 3 points you supposed to make, one about politics, one about the individual, and one about the economy, as your second speaker kind of accepted, when you move in closer on that, you end up with just 2 points, and the fact is that the individual leads to politics, and that's essential. And our main response to that is politics and democracy is always unstable. Democracy, there's always something that upsets it. For every Cambridge Analytica scandal, which you've leaned on heavily today, there's an Arab Spring, which was organised on Facebook. Data allows people to cooperate. It improves the strength of democracy. Any argument you make about big tech undermining democracy is an argument against people who are making a decision to try and influence others. That's always happened, be it with leaflet campaigns or big tech. The ability to do it is not something that's particular to big tech, it's something that's particular to social networks, which is not what we're talking about today. We're talking about something completely different. This next point, and I think you pressed this home rather well and thoroughly, but incorrectly, is that market instability is much higher with big tech companies. And the thing you point to is if these tech companies collapse, our data's gone. We don't have our laptops, we don't have our phones. But your second speaker spoke at length about how valuable this data is. Am I meant to believe that a market for data of bankrupt firms will not spring up? This data will not be held and kept because it is so valuable? No, it will be kept because, as you have rightly pointed out, this data is valuable to corporations. And therefore, the idea that when these big tech companies fail, if they do, and I want you to remind you of the fact that we have made it quite clear that they will not, as our second speaker said, because they have absolutely no incentive to try risky behaviours because they don't want to undermine consumer confidence, that data will be bought. The next point is that you spoke about smaller companies not being able to work well under big tech. The point here is that big tech companies have a symbiotic relationship with innovative companies. If I'm a small software developer, I require Amazon Web Services, Google Host, a large amount of data storage in order to test my product and work on it. Are you proposing that instead we require every startup to build its own data centers and fund that massive investment? And that is a more productive way to run our economy than let lots of people try and fail on a cheap and simple platform? I think not. And the last point is that this leads to increased productive capacity in the economy because when lots of people are in one place, and this feeds back into the democracy argument, there are network effects. If you're doing something on a social network, lots of people want to be on it with you. And when more people are on it, you also want to, other people want to join. And these things grow. They become more valuable as they get bigger. Facebook especially, Google+. One of the key values of technology, one of the most valuable things about it is the increased ability to communicate. They become better tools for communication as they grow larger. And that's the point I want to leave with. Thank you.
Can you hear me at that? I would first like to, I'm Paddy. I'm speaking for litigation. I would first like to pick up on the affirmative's case that politics and democracy is always unstable. That is simply not true. We have seen vast sways of political stability. For example, 1997 to 2007, pre-crash, was very stable here in the UK. Post-crash, we've seen periods of lower stability, and as we try to return to stability, the big tech firms have destabilised our country at its worst in our very own country. The 2016 Brexit referendum saw millions of Facebook users have their data illegally harvested and used without their consent. Facebook facilitated the EU in their successful operation to target people and extract data from them without their knowledge, who the surveys they were completing and saying were being paid for. Facebook have showed us they are not willing to change. When Zuckerberg appeared before Congress, he was not able to deny politicians can lie on Facebook when questioned by Congress. They cited the Arab Spring organised on Facebook as proof that democracy they said politics and democracy is always unstable, and the Arab Spring, organised on Facebook, proved that democracy was always unstable. It was only because of the monopoly big tech had over all the people in those countries affected that they were able to bring about political change, good or bad, that overall was incredibly destabilising. They argued small businesses will not be helped or are helped by big tech. I completely disagree. The high barriers to entry put in by big tech corporations like Apple, who were able to avoid €13 billion euros of tax in the Republic of Ireland from 2004 to 2014, and Amazon, who's grown their patent portfolio from 1,000 to 10,000 in only 4 years, help small business. They do not. They destroy local economies, as we've seen on the high street, which can be incredibly destabilising for us all. In my own hometown, it's now more likely to see a closed shutter or a closing down sign than it is to see an open trading shop front, eroding our community and seeing job losses across the board. I would also like to talk about how they said if big tech collapses, that there will be small firms that suddenly pop up and access our data and sell it back to us. Well, how kind of them, but A, there may be legal barriers for that to happen, for that not to be able to happen. And I hope that my data isn't just sold to someone in a garage in Silicon Valley that's able to access it illegally. I hope that my data is protected, which was exactly their point, which does not make any sense. How could it be sold but both protected at the same time? Big tech's hoarding of this data is incredibly destabilising for our country. The idea that these corporations they presented are risk-free in this case, that if they collapse, nothing will happen. Well, how can that company be so risk-free and yet stake so much on innovation? Innovation and research and development has such an element of risk. That is the point. You're spending your excess capital investing in risky projects. This is not what they do though. They do steal their ideas, like my colleague said, from the state, and their risky operations are minimised because they have a very little innovation in themselves.
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah?
Yes.
Okay, cool. So I'm the final speaker, and it's my job to tell you why our side has won the debate. So, they ended with a point about excess capital being invested in risky ventures. That's called investment, right? That's what the economy is driven by. So, like, do they take issue with risk or not? And let's have a look at what they said. So there are basically 2 points within this debate. There's a clash about economic instability, and there's a clash about politics and culture. Let's start with economic instability. They believe that small firms are the way to smooth the business cycle, and yet they also believe that small firms take risk, which they think is a good thing because it drives innovation. I mean, sure, but like if you take issue with firms taking risk, which they do, because monopolies take risk, obviously, all firms have to take risk, then why do they think that their side has a more stable economy with small firms, as they put it, taking more risk, somehow smoothing the business cycle? If we're talking about lack of competition, so they refer to raising barriers to entry, monopolistic behaviour, undercutting other companies on prices. We don't deny the truth of that. We don't deny that there is imperfect competition and that they act as monopolies. But there is a glaring contradiction in their case, which is that they object on economic grounds to the existence of a monopoly because they say it limits innovation. But what do we mean by innovation in this case? Innovation is getting people to use your social media platform. So essentially, the aim of innovation is to get people hooked on your platform. So on their side, when they talk about small firms with their highly risky strategy driving innovation, what they're actually talking about is more innovation which is hooking more people onto their platforms, and therefore the social effects which they take such issue with still stand and are in fact more significant on their side. So what they really take issue with is the existence of such technology that can hook people, which is not what the debate's about. Okay, let's talk about democracy and politics. I mean, sure, let's widen the debate to democracy rather than just economics. So, they mentioned the period from 1997 to 2007 as a paragon of stability. For a start, there was the Iraq War, so it's not exactly stable. It was the biggest protest in UK history. Secondly, that was a period of very significant economic growth in this country. And finally, they ignore the basic point of statistics, which is that correlation does not mean causation, and that the fact that most tech companies were founded just after the recession does not mean that the instability of the economy now is because of their existence. And the point about lobbying works both ways, right? So like, you're centralizing power into the hands of a small group of people who have quite a lot of influence on politics. But what you also do is create a small group of people who, if politicians want to enforce regulation, it's much easier because there is only one company or a very small group of companies to actually enforce it. So it makes enforcement easier. So they took issue with lobbying, but they also hope that their data is secure. So they think that the regulations are both insufficient and that they're sufficient to protect our data when the tech companies fall, which is just a contradiction. So overall, our points on economics stand. All of our points on economics stand. And we have undermined their points about politics such that it is clear that big tech monopolies are more productive for the economy and for society than they are destabilising. Thank you.
At this point, we will take questions from the audience. The judges can stop taking notes now. After that, we will have the judges' deliberation, so the debaters will be leaving the room for that time. But do you guys have any questions?
I think kind of implicit in the discussion, but kind of never brought up, what I think it should have been, is when we talk about a small group of CEOs and shareholders getting control over democracy. I mean, democracy isn't itself unstable. But a firm will have qualitatively different intentions to a democracy, because a democracy has to live with the externalities, whereas the corporate entity isn't concerned with that. So when you have the rapid advancement of tech, which is, nobody's denying that's unstabilising, it's just we can't decide whether it happens. When you have the rapid advancement of tech under the control of shareholder value directing it, surely that's going to lead to externalities which democracy could prevent, like environmental destruction, lack of good jobs, introducing completely disruptive technologies to the economy.
I think the reason that point wasn't brought up during the debate is because it's not explicitly relevant to big tech. You've mentioned both high CEO remuneration and the amount of power that shareholders have. And actually environmental degradation. What happens is that is something that is true of oil companies, of tobacco companies. And the reason it wasn't fixated on here is because this debate was primarily about big tech. And that trait, the ability to influence democracy, is something that's true of all big companies, not just big tech companies. And I think the opposition worked to try and focus on the big tech aspect, and therefore didn't mention that as an important point. So,
the only reason I bring it up is just that it was never disputed in the debate that big tech, with its barriers to entry and its monopolisation and 90% market share and so forth, has been a whole new world of monopolisation. You never disputed that when they said that lobbying was having extreme control. You said democracy was already unstable, so it doesn't matter.
But we're not disputing. Firstly, we're not disputing. Democracy is already unstable. Secondly, we're not disputing the monopoly. Our key point is that it's the best available option, and that with small companies you don't get the same level of investment in innovation because of the high capital cost investing in technology. And therefore, we don't have a problem with the high monopoly power. It's not the monopoly power we have a problem with. We argue that it is more productive than it is destabilising. We admit in part it is destabilising, but the value added to it to the economy and, as the other side rightly said, to politics is less than the destabilising effect.
There's this quote from this guy, I've forgotten who it is, after the dot-com bubble crashed, where he said something to the effect of, yes, it crashed, yes, a lot of people lost their jobs, but the long-lasting effects that the development of the internet, which happened in the late 90s and early 2000s, has had on the economy far outweighs the negative effects, which is a problematic argument, and I think it rightly should be disputed as an argument. But I think it's a very important point to be made that it's the debate about whether the long-lasting impact that economic behavior of any kind, not just monopoly behavior, has on the economy, as opposed to the negative effects.
Another question?
I have a question for the team from Manchester, but the team from Durham can answer as well. I want to touch on the point of the necessity of huge investment to actually compete in the market. That is definitely true, but at the same time, most of the big tech firms started in the 70s and 80s with little to no investment. And I wanted to have your insight on what is different today, why that same practice is no longer as easy, at least. So why can competition arise now as easy as it was for the same company that now ruled the market?
Great question. So back in the day, we had MySpace, and they didn't think MySpace would fall, but then MySpace offered to buy Facebook for 15 million. Facebook was like, nah, they left, and MySpace fell. Facebook ended up becoming the market leader. So there was ways that companies could get to the top, and now you see Facebook. They bought WhatsApp when they were making losses for $19 billion. Facebook is buying out competition. They have, I think I mentioned this, it's killer acquisition. You're not really having startups become huge things because they end up merging to the big companies. So it just becomes another little part of a big company. It's not, being allowed to grow by itself, which is what makes it so hard. It's not just to start up, it's continuing, which is difficult.
Yeah, to touch on that, I think it's in the 1970s and 80s, especially in the tech industry, there was very little competition. There was extreme opportunities extreme opportunities in the market, essentially. I think today you can still find those opportunities, but I don't think it's in the tech industry. There needs to be a new way of innovation. because the tech industry, as she rightly pointed out, is so highly competitive because of the monopolies.
Well, real quick. So you're saying that there are no, like the market for innovation of technologies and social networks and production is crowded.
Just as an asterisk, you guys can speak as your individuals
Yeah,
if you,
that's
okay.
I would, sorry, you said for technology specifically?
Yeah, you were talking about big techs. So
I definitely think there's still scope to innovate in technology, that, like, for sure. But I think if for example, if a startup was to do that, as she rightly pointed out, the likelihood is that they're going to be acquired. So I think to make your profits via innovating in technology, it would be extremely tough. I still think there's going to be plenty of innovation in technology, but I think like if you want to, innovate to make the next big thing, whatever, like the next Amazon, I'm not entirely sure it's going to be in technology. You'll have to utilize it, yes, but I'm not sure it's going to be in technology. Personal opinion, once again.
I mean, I also think there's something to be said for how do things happen, right? How does economic production happen in capitalism? So you have an idea and you work on it, and then you approach an investor, or an investor approaches you and says, hey, I'm going to give you a load of money if you make this thing, right? I'm not sure of the specifics, but I'm guessing that's what happened with tech startups in the 80s as well. That they started out as the same thing that happened with Facebook and Amazon in the mid-2000s, right? That they started out with small startups. Some rich people came to them and said, hey, I'm going to give you some money if you want to build this bigger. They said, yeah. Or got bullied into it, whichever interpretation you want. So I think that's just like how capitalist development happens.
So you're distinguishing from acquisition to investment. Like today is more based on acquisitions, like aggressive marketing.
I'll let another question in if anyone has other questions. Yeah.
This is for the affirmative on financial stability. So you differentiated the big banks with the big tech firms by saying that big banks take up risky financial positions and hold cash overseas. The big tech firms have huge amounts of corporate bonds held in overshores accounts. And when there's trends suggesting that we're likely to enter a downturn, how is this different?
So yeah, I'll admit I did run out of some time, so I could have explained that a little bit better. I think what I was trying to get at is that, both tech and both big bank, respectively, have offshore accounts with, millions.
They're not famous for their taxpayer.
Yeah, like trillions and trillions of money. The difference is that when big bank collapses, so does aggregate demand. But when big tech collapses, not necessarily. Because when big bank collapses, the entire economy goes to a standstill because they hoard cash, the banks, and they can't loan out to consumers who were indebted in the financial crisis. Whereas when big tech falls, that's not necessarily the case because it doesn't affect consumption as much. It's almost analogous to, big tech is analogous to the housing market, but it would be then the big banks hoarding of cash and debt that which results in the whole financial crisis.
Sorry, if I can just ask a follow-up on that.
Yeah.
So, it's obviously outside the debate, but for example now, with the increase of people using things like, Samsung Pay, Apple Pay, this sort of thing, isn't there like a merger of almost, consumption using your phone, for example? Isn't that going to cause an issue, or would you disagree?
I think it could. Yeah, I think that would have been a useful thing in the debate. I think that's a good point.
Yeah. I disagree to some extent because Apple Pay is just using your current account on your phone. It's still run by Barclays or Lloyds or
That's
whatever.
also true.
Right, it's in the same way that PayPal is a tech company used for payments, but PayPal isn't heavily leveraged in derivative trading overseas. So there's a real separation between the activities of investment banks and the risks they're willing to take on, and the activities of tech firms where they're not pursuing the highest rate of return in order to get more customers in the same way that big banks were. They're pursuing the highest rate of return in order to invest in new products and to get shareholder value. So there's different motives there, and as a result, you have different incentives.
I think also, as you said, Apple Pay is essentially just a catalyst or to speed up the transaction, but the problem ends up in the transaction itself, not the technology associated.
But what I was meaning of that is that it's kind of a measure, so I'm sure a lot of people here have heard of Revolut or these kind of online tech banks, which is basically almost like a bank on your phone.
Okay, I'll just take, sorry guys, I do want to get everyone out of here. I'll take one more question and then we'll go to the judges.
So this is just a question to the Manchester team. And it's you say that it's hard to enter the market because of kind of these big tech corporations. but would you say it's kind of in part also made easier because of them? Because of the kind of universal platforms that they provide, such as Facebook being a good platform for kind of sourcing your audience and being able to promote your product more cheaply, sometimes within very few funds, and platforms like Google Analytics, which allow companies which maybe otherwise would not have the funding to be able to have such good tools.
Well, I don't doubt that there is a lot of power in that. Again, with the whole idea of platform discrimination, the moment Google decides, oh, you're a competitor, they can choose to manipulate their search algorithm so you stop coming up. So I think while there is a world in which that is definitely a way in which smaller businesses do come up, the problem of both network biases and the idea of killer acquisition sort of outweigh that. So it's great if you're like a bracelet company trying to come up on these platforms, but if you're, for example, the next Instagram, that's going to be less helpful for you.
It also depends on what platform you mean, because if you're a bracelet maker on Amazon, they can usually just copy you and then just take your ideas and make you go bankrupt.
On that fun note, I'm going to ask all the debaters on both sides to leave the room. And yeah, so how much time do you think you'll leave? 5 minutes? 10? 5, okay, for the public, if you guys just stay here, then they'll come back in an hour.
Literally, the last point is my whole dissertation. So the book
It's less fair on Durham's side. Because then the Durham doesn't have the same. Wait, you say the he keeps starting. Okay, I'm not gonna say it. I will, usually listening to the different starting sentences. He says this is a contradiction. Yeah. That's right. Yeah. I mean, yeah, because unless the same thing is right, She's My point, okay, personally, the last one, this guy, so to me, it's about presentation of our because even though I did teach classes, it's great. I think we're both should
Like we were saying, it's about the intellectual dialectic economic logic. It's not a competition. No, but I was so happy when you made that point. I was like, is someone going to realize this? No one realized.
Wait, I want you to explain.
I'll explain to you. Well, basically,
okay. Thank you everyone for being here today. The judges had a lot of deliberation while you guys were gone. Again, to review what the awards will be, we will have one Best Speaker from Durham, one Best Speaker from Manchester, and then the judges will announce who won a Best Team. The Best Team will be leaving with a lovely gift card from Blackwell's as well. So if the judges want to come to provide the speaker.
What was that?
I mean, if you want to first provide the speaker awards and then...
All right, so to say who they are.
Yeah.
Okay, so it was difficult to decide because everybody spoke well, everybody was confident, everybody projected themselves well. At the same time, to a certain degree, Manchester had two slight advantages, one of which is home ground, the other one is obviously the fact that their case is an easier one to make if all that you have, ironically, is Google. Because you Google any of the big tech companies, you come back with an awful lot of data and arguments from The Guardian and things about how terrible they are. It's slightly more difficult to make the pro case in certain ways. And then they've got the difficulty of the fact that most people's economics that you taught as an undergraduate makes it very difficult to make that case. And I might say why that is the case later. But even on that basis, we thought that we agreed that the best speaker on this side was Mary, was it?
If we can take a photo.
Judges,
if you want Okay.
So for the Durham side, so we agreed that the best speaker was Patrick.
Hold your award. Beautiful. All right.
So now we announce the best team, yeah? So I think we agreed that it was a good quality debate. The arguments were well put. I think we were quite surprised. Given that you guys are mostly first and second years, we understand how hard this is, and we can see that you made a lot of preparation. So I think it was a good quality debate. Even though we would expect maybe a little bit more of depth or maybe critical discussions of some concepts, but I guess that may be some of the consequences of an economics teaching. But overall I thought it was really good, and I think we agreed that the debate was quite productive. So for the best team, do you want to announce?
Manchester.
Okay.
I'm not sure.
There you go. Yep. Beautiful guys. All right. Jamie, did you want to say a couple last things?
Oh,
yeah.
If you guys can sit back now.
How many people in this room do economics at Manchester then? Yeah. So as an undergraduate, how much do you think of what you were taught would help you answer the question that these people had to struggle with? The relationship between productivity, changes in technology, market structure and the world. I mean, that's a fundamentally important question, isn't it? And it is important in terms of many things that these people discuss. The nature of democracy, the nature of socialisation, what technologies do to us as people, the nature of our relationships in work. All of those things are fundamental issues that we will all have to deal with. They're not some abstract thing in a textbook. They're not just concepts. That's the world you're living in. But how much of what do you think you get taught as an undergraduate will actually help you with that? When you pick up a standard textbook and it will introduce you to the idea of market structure. And the very first market it will teach you is the one that's in 1890, which is in Marshall's book, Principles of Economics, which then is turned into the neoclassical form you see today by Frank Knight. And that is perfect competition. Does anybody think perfect competition exists in the world? It absolutely doesn't. It's the fundamental of the assumptions of what is homo economicus, isn't it? And without that kind of calculative individual, you cannot have perfect competition. Therefore, the very basis of efficiency that we use to measure the world cannot exist. So the very first fundamental flaw that you have, the first fundamental problem to deal with is the world you live in, the technological dynamism of capitalism has nothing to do with the market structure, which is basic to fundamentals of policy that we're constantly trying to create in the world, based on the fact that we think perfect competition is the ideal. And yet we live in a world of monopolies. The question then is, if we live in that kind of world and we have to be realistic and accept that about it, how is it we regulate them and how is it we understand and explain the causal mechanisms which produce their effects in the world? Now the fundamental issue, isn't it, about productivity is the fact that in a capitalist system, the fundamental dynamic of a capitalist system is creative destruction. It is supposed to be destabilising in order to be productive. The question is, what is the nature of that kind of destabilisation? How do we control it for proper purposes and prevent its worst excesses? So it's not a question of either or, it's what do we do with the reality of it? Now then, what are the fundamental problems at the moment of industrial structure and things to do with technology? It's a potential for a fourth industrial revolution compared to the environmental problem we have. So will we be in a situation where we live in capitalism, where our jobs may be displaced, and rapidly so? However, do we want to live in the kind of economy which is inherently growing, and one where we may be living in a system which requires us to earn wages which we may not be able to earn in order to live? So there may be a fundamental contradiction coming between the expansion of our system, based on the technologies that allow us to do that, the environmental sustainability of it, and the way in which we've set up our social systems and political systems inside it to allow us to live in that system. Now then, that is the destabilising crux of this problem, isn't it? Productivity is just one tiny aspect of a much, much bigger problem. The question is, you pick up one of your textbooks, does it mention any of this stuff? Does it have anything relative to say about that? Nothing at all. It will tell you, is this efficient? Is it not efficient? But its primary example and its primary contrast, its thing it wants you to look at, and the thing which informs policy, is perfect competition. Something that has never existed and cannot exist. So from a post-crash point of view, the thing you should take away from this is, your textbooks are useless.
Thank you so much, guys.
No, yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for coming, thank you for paying attention. Our next event is going to be Victoria Bateman, The Sex Factor. I strongly encourage you to come along. Also, Postcrash is recruiting, so if you feel like this is something you would want to be involved in, please